This
presentation.
conference will now be recorded.
This is the first presentation I've done online, so let's hope everything goes smoothly. It looks like a positive start. Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining the meeting. Andy, thank you for your introduction. Yes, as you say, I have been very closely involved with the transfer of the Core Valley lines since September 2017. So I was not right in at the beginning, but close to the beginning. As I say there, I've been working as a consultant. I'm not a full-time employee of Transport for Wales, but I've been working with them very closely on actually creating a successful asset transfer, and that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. So the first problem I've got now is actually scrolling through the slides. So apologies for that. Not quite sure why I can't move on from the current slide.
Just need to click on the slide.
Yeah, click on the slide and then try it. Yeah.
Have you got that now? Have you got the map?
Yeah, you've got the map now.
Good.
Lovely. Thank you.
Right. That's good. That is the second slide. I wasn't sure what to expect in terms of familiarity by those attending the meeting of the geography of the Core Valley line. So I thought it would be useful to just start with a map, as you're seeing there. The Core Valley lines are the area shaded in that sort of light pinky yellow colour, and the lines run up the valleys which radiate north of Cardiff, a bit like the fingers of a hand, up to Treherbert, Aberdare, Merthyr Tydfil, Rumney, and also a little spur down at the south end from Cardiff Queen Street running down to Cardiff Bay. Don't be fooled by the map. It does look as if there's a junction at Cardiff Bay with the down main line between Newport and Cardiff. That's actually not quite correct. It doesn't really work like that, but that gives you an idea of the geography. And for those of you with some familiarity with railway history, the names Rumney and the Taff, the Taff being one of the major river systems of the valleys, of course, have echoes of an illustrious railway history of the companies that built a very complex network of railways in the valleys, primarily to serve the very productive coalfields and to bring the coal down for export from Cardiff docks in particular. So that is the area we are talking about. When we put it in the context of a South Wales Metro, I think the first point that I should make is that the South Wales Metro network is more extensive than just the Core Valley lines, but the focus for tonight is talking about the transfer of those valley lines away from Network Rail into government ownership, owned by the Welsh Government, and now being managed under a different infrastructure management arrangement. And I'm going to discuss the nature of that during the course of this presentation. And Andy, as you said in the introduction, that transfer took effect on the 28th of March this year, just as COVID-19 hit us. I should make it very clear, I'm not going to talk about the effects of COVID in this presentation. I'm going to talk about the transfer as it happened, the steps we took to make it happen, and the intentions behind it. So,
Right, We seem to have lost Colin there a moment. If you hang on a second, I'm sure we can get the connection back. I don't know what's happened there.
Andy Franklin, Andrew Wilson speaking. If we don't hear from Colin in a couple of minutes, I'll give him a call and see if, or make sure he realises where we are.
Okay, do you want to give him a call anyway? And we'll...
Right, okay, we'll do.
He's probably trying to reconnect. I don't know what's happened. But, he's gone completely out of the thing, isn't he? So, okay, I very apologise for this, but I'm sure we'll sort this out in a few minutes and we'll be back online again. So.
This conference will now be recorded.
Right.
Okay. Well, apologies for that. I was talking away to myself. I thought it was all going swimmingly. I was aware of my mobile going crazy because Andrew was trying to reach me. So if it starts going again, I'll know something similar has happened. Right. Let's hope we can sail through this with no problems this time. I was just describing the core valley lines in the geography of the core valleys, and for the sake of perhaps repeating what you may have heard, I was just describing the valley lines as the yellowish shaded area on that map, and the valley lines radiate like fingers of a hand out from Cardiff. And you may be aware, if you know your railway history, the valleys, the Taff, the Rumney. These are names which are very familiar, perhaps to those of you who know your railway history, because they're railways that were built by a number of private companies, very complex network to serve the mining region of Southeast Wales and to export the coal down from the pits down to the docks at Cardiff especially, but also Newport and Barry for export. So it's a railway with significant history, not perhaps quite so much history as winding the clock right back to the early 19th century and almost the origins of railways in the Penydarren Tramroad and the railway built by Richard Trevithick, which was a great pioneering venture serving the growing industrial region that was that part of South Wales and the Cardiff valleys. Now, of course, I am not claiming that that the subject of what we're discussing tonight is anywhere near as pioneering as was the Penydarren Tramroad back in 1804, but nevertheless, it is pioneering what I'm describing, and I'm going to talk about the concept of a South Wales Metro, why it's important, why it was deemed necessary to change the ownership of the valley lines, how that was put into practice, what the process was for realizing that transfer, and then managing the infrastructure as we go on. And then towards the end, I'll just reflect on some of the lessons that we've learned from that over time. I should say something about Transport for Wales as an organisation first of all. If you're not familiar with it, it's a very young organisation, established only back in 2016. It's a wholly owned organisation, owned by the Welsh Government, not-for-profit body, currently based in Cardiff, but in the course of having a brand new headquarters building in Pontypridd, which you see in the picture there. Of course, with COVID-19, nobody's moved in there yet, but the plan is to move there as soon as possible. When I joined back in September 2017, there was a very small number of permanent employees, certainly if you couldn't count them on the fingers of one hand, you could on two, and that's grown quite rapidly to over 300. But that's not all on rail projects. Transport for Wales has taken on train catering staff, taken over that process. It's involved in the bus networks in Wales, on the issue of travel cards and concession cards and the like. So it's got an all-embracing transport portfolio as it exists to advise and support and to deliver the Welsh Government's transport policies and objectives. When I started at TfW, the rail services in the valleys were operated by Arriva Trains Wales. They ran on a network which was part of the national network. It was owned and managed by Network Rail. But very quickly, that began to change. The Welsh Government had powers devolved for franchising rail services, and it entered into a competitive dialogue process with bidding groups for the new franchise and for the realisation of the South Wales Metro concept. And that was done initially through a long programme of what's called competitive dialogue, where the bidding groups come in and talk to the client organisation about their aspirations, their output requirements and the like, as a precursor to actually going through the formal tendering and bid evaluation process. By the time we got to the tender, the initial 4 bidding groups had reduced to 2. Arriva pulled out, and the other group was unfortunately holed under the water by the collapse of Carillion during the process. So we ended up with 2 bidding groups, and after evaluation in the first half of 2018, the Welsh Government awarded the operator and development partner contract known as the Grant Agreement to Keolis Amy Wales, and that grant agreement is for a 15-year duration, and that was signed on the 4th of June in 2018. So what's happened so far is that the first priority was to transfer the operation of rail services in the whole of Wales and the Welsh cross-border services into England from Arriva Trains Wales to Keolis Amy. That happened on the 14th of October in 2018, so just a 4-month transfer process there. And those new rail services are operating under the TfW Rail Services branding, as you can see in the picture, with one of the new livery trains facing off the old livery ATW trains. But it's more than about rail services. It's about delivering the South Wales Metro concept. It is about the design, management, integration, delivery of the transformation of the Welsh valleys, and it's about the delivery of infrastructure management services on the Welsh Valley lines. And as you can see in that little block diagram there, the ODP Keolis Amy is in effect divided into 2 delivery arms: OPCO, which is delivering the rail services across the whole of Wales, and Infraco, which is focusing on the delivery of transformation and management of the infrastructure on the valley lines, which is the subject we're looking at tonight. So I'm just going to say a little bit about the railway that has been transferred, first of all, in the valleys. It's a legacy railway. These pictures show the southern tip of the network at Cardiff Bay. The picture in the middle is the old Bute Road station, which is a Grade 2 listed building. I think since I took that photograph, it's been substantially renovated and probably looks a lot better than it did back then. But nevertheless, it's a legacy railway. It's a railway that stops short of the development area in Cardiff Bay, which you can see in the bottom picture, which includes the Millennium Centre, the Welsh Government building as well. So it's a railway that doesn't necessarily serve well the modern demand that has developed as Cardiff has regenerated. The Valleys network also shows the biggest growth in demand for travel. You can see on that pie chart that over a period of 10 years, the vast majority of increased demand for rail services was in South East Wales. That's obviously not just limited to the Valley lines, that will include all the areas around Newport as well. But nevertheless, it's an area that has seen significant demand for rail services, as has much of the rest of the network in the British Isles. But it has one or two particular characteristics to draw attention to as well. First of all, the Cardiff region is the most densely populated part of Wales, and it also is populated by the lowest age profile of anywhere in the country. That immediately says things about the kind of the demand for leisure travel, for work travel, for commuting, and so on, that the railways are there to meet and to deliver on. But at the same time, it also is an area to the north of Cardiff, and certainly in the valleys themselves. It's an area of considerable social deprivation, and that diagram that you're seeing there is a map of indexed deprivation, which includes measures of health, welfare, housing, education, employment opportunities, and the like. And it is an extremely deprived area of Wales, although Cardiff itself is a relatively thriving economy. Certainly to the north in the valleys, that is far from the case. And so, and this is, I think, where it all fell apart when I suddenly realized that nobody was listening to me. We'd got to this point. And this is a piece of legislation which underpins some of the idea for the South Wales Metro. It is the Wellbeing of Future Generations Wales Act requires public bodies to look at all of those objectives of creating a healthier Wales, of a more equal Wales. We hear a lot about levelling up between the north and south of England, but this is also about levelling up, if I can use that terminology, and it's creating better employment, about creating better employment opportunities as well, and better community connections. So this is an underpinning concept behind the idea, the policy idea of the Welsh Government for a South Wales Metro. It is aimed at improving public transport, creating better capacity, about introducing new services, new trains, and it is about creating better opportunities for travel, better opportunities for access to employment and leisure, as a way of trying to address some of those social issues in the southeast of Wales. That's the concept behind the South Wales Metro. And if I show you a map here of the extent of the whole metro network, which includes the core valley lines themselves, you'll see that in many cases the aspiration is to double the service levels from 2 to 4 trains an hour. South of Pontypridd coming to up to 12 trains an hour, almost a turn up and walk on service with new trains. And I'm not going to talk particularly, because we're probably now a bit stretched for time, I'm not going to talk too much about the new trains, but one of the concepts behind the South Wales Metro that is worth emphasising is that the line that will adopt the old 1 mile branch line from Cardiff Queen Street down to Cardiff Bay. The plan is to extend that and to run bi-mode tram trains coming down from the valleys through Cardiff Queen Street and then to run down and to run on street as trams down more fully into the Cardiff Bay area, and potentially also to improve connectivity with Cardiff Central Station. Which at the moment, if you're travelling from Cardiff Bay, you need to catch a train up to Cardiff Queen Street, change and come back down to Cardiff Central. Part of the idea of the Metro is to improve that connectivity and maybe to act as a catalyst for more on-street running in the city itself in due course. I'm not going to talk about CVL transformation particularly. I just need to touch on it. You've had, I think, in the section of a previous presentation on that a couple of years back, and it may well be worth something coming back to in the future. But essentially, there is a very substantial government budget for transforming the Valley Lines, £750 million. That includes ERDF funding. Work is underway. It's beginning to get underway at the moment. It's a massive program, and the map, you can't see the detail on the map, but it includes redoubling of track, it includes remodeling junctions, it includes new stations, platform extensions, the introduction of the new rolling stock, electrification using permanently earthed sections to avoid too much civils intervention works and bridge raising or track lowering, moving the control of the whole Valley's lines away from the Welsh operating centre at Cardiff to a new control centre at Taffs Well, which will also be the home of a major new rolling stock depot. So that's a very brief snapshot of transformation, and there you see a plan of what is intended as the depot, and over at the far left hand side you can perhaps just pick out, it says CVL ICC. That's the proposed new control centre, which in due course, when that's complete and commissioned, will take over the operational control of the entire Valley Lines from the existing Network Rail operating centre in Cardiff. But all of that really is by way of background, because what I want to focus on now is to talk about how the transfer of ownership was put into effect, taking it out from the Network Rail management and creating a new model of delivering infrastructure management as part of the South Wales Metro project. So in effect, at transfer, what happened legally was that the Core Valley Line railway assets, the whole of the infrastructure, transferred from Network Rail to the Welsh Government. So they are now publicly owned, Welsh Government owned railway assets. They are then leased to the ODP, the Amy Keolis organisation, in order for them to work on the transformation and to deliver infrastructure management services. And Amy Keolis Infrastructure Limited is the infrastructure management body. It operates under its safety management system. It is therefore the authorized has the safety authorization from the ORR. It holds the network license to act as the infrastructure manager for the Valley Lines, and without actually achieving all that, of course, legally no transfer could ever take place. So there was a big process around getting to that point, but it was actually much more complicated than that, as I will touch on in a moment. I should talk a little bit about how those infrastructure management services are scoped. The grant agreement, the contract between the ODP and the Welsh Government is a very extensive document. It extends to well over 900 pages, but Schedule 3A of it is in effect the maintenance contract. And for those of you with a history and remember far enough back to the attempts that the railway industry made in the mid-1990s to contract out maintenance under the Railtrack RT1A contracts, with all of the issues around those contracts, we're treading on the same ground, but hopefully we have intended to make that in a different way, certainly, and to have learned the lessons from the past. The scope of the contract covers almost the entirety of the Core Valley Line infrastructure assets, except for some of the telecoms networks, the FTN and GSMR telecoms network, which is a national network. It proved unwise and far too difficult to try and carve them out from the national management of those networks by Network Rail, so they remain with Network Rail. But otherwise, the IM AKIL is responsible for delivering the operational management of the infrastructure. That's signaling control. It will be power and electrification control. It's all the asset management planning. It's day-to-day infrastructure management, which includes all the inspection, faulting, maintenance planning, maintenance delivery, to some extent also renewals delivery, although the AKIL, Amy Keolis Infrastructure Limited organisation, will not deliver all infrastructure renewals on the network, but when they're not delivering them, they will act as the managing agent for other parties who are contracted directly to Transport for Wales to actually deliver those. But AKIL will either deliver them directly or be a managing agent for them. It's also about managing the knowledge of the assets, about data quality, it's about asset protection, the full range of what you would expect, obviously, from an infrastructure manager. Now, buried in the contract, there is some quite specific requirement around the quality of infrastructure management and the quality of asset knowledge, which we know has been an ongoing thorn in the flesh for railway infrastructure management over a long period of time. And the contract tries to root the new infrastructure managers' asset management regime into best practice asset management. There is a requirement for them to achieve the high level of accreditation of ISO 55001, and that is really built in as an expectation, as an obligation on the infrastructure manager to operate in that way. But of course, there are lots of challenges around this as well, and challenges in the way even that the bid could be put together. Actually achieving a good balance, the right balance between delivering infrastructure maintenance and renewal, particularly at a time when the bidding groups were preparing their bids. The quality and the coverage of knowledge of the state of the CVL network itself was a huge challenge. We tried in the invitation to tender to provide as much information as we could access in TFW about the state of the CVL, but clearly that was limited. And so the bids themselves came forward not fully informed by a real in-depth understanding of the state of the network. And so to tackle that, we've actually created a structure, and I won't go into a huge amount of detail on this slide, but we've tried to create a structure where certain of the services are already price fixed. There's no mechanism for Amy Keolis to actually get additional funding for the things that they could have predicted and scoped fully. But there are two other asset categories here, or categories of pricing around the charging mechanism, firm charging and emerging charging. And that's where we recognise that they needed to learn more about the assets, and the mechanism there is to enable Amy Keolis to adjust with our agreement the pricing mechanisms for delivering maintenance on asset categories that they needed to find out more about as time progressed. And particularly there at the bottom, you see perhaps earthworks, structures, off-track drainage. These are some of the areas which were least well understood, for which perhaps data quality was less than desirable. And as you will see in the Rogues Gallery coming up shortly, where perhaps some of the most significant problems on the CVL actually exists. So there is a mechanism for price adjustment to reflect that emerging knowledge base of the condition of the assets. The contract itself goes through a number of 3 key stages. There's the pre-asset transfer phase, which lasted from the signature of the grant agreement in June 2018 right through to asset transfer on the 28th of March 2020. We're now into a transformation stage where Amy will be delivering the transformation works that I just touched on briefly a moment ago. And at the end of transformation, we then get into a steady state of railway where the focus will very much be on managing the infrastructure in its new form and its new guise with all of the transformation works in place. But what I'm going to do is talk particularly about what that phase was between June 2018 and the end of March this year. And straight away, you know, perhaps just draw attention to the fact I commented that it took 4 months to transfer the rail services from Arriva to Keolis Amy. And you'll see from this that it took far longer, 22 months, to actually effect the asset transfer, to take the ownership of the assets out of Network Rail and to transfer them to Welsh Government ownership. And I'm going to talk about 4 things. This is not in any sense intended to be a manual on how to do asset transfer. It's far too complex, it's far too long a topic, but I'm just going to touch very briefly on what the framework of that transfer looked like, that some of the process that we went through with Amy Keolis in terms of mobilisation and getting ready for the transfer. I'm going to touch on the safety verification aspects, and then I'm going to talk about some of the emerging experience of what was called discovery, which was the opportunity for Amy Keolis to get on the ground and to look in more detail at some of the assets on a sampling basis before they took them over, to understand more about where the issues and the challenges were. This is a busy diagram, and I'm not going to describe it in any great detail, but there were significant what were called conditions precedent before any transfer could take place. There was a transfer framework agreement signed initially between Transport for Wales and Network Rail. In other words, that set the framework for effecting the transfer. It committed the parties to work collaboratively and with due diligence and all the things you would expect to be in an agreement, and also how it would actually work. TfW itself needed to inform and advise Welsh Government. The change of ownership would be enacted under a transfer scheme, and the legal powers for that were under a Transport and Works Act order. But before Welsh Government could and would be prepared to sign up to the transfer, it needed to understand what it was taking on. And so TfW was heavily involved in actually developing a business case for Welsh Government sign-off, which included a very significant look ahead as a 30-year cost profile for the ownership, the operation, the maintenance and the renewal of the valley lines. There was a big piece of work that TfW did on that. And then, of course, there needed to be assurance. There needed to be assurance about the safety, the legality, the deliverability of transfer when it happened. Nobody was prepared to press the button on transfer until there was an absolute confidence that we were ready and that the parties were ready, and that the moment the clock ticked to midnight and the transfer took legal effect, the new infrastructure manager was in post, was properly resourced, had all the systems in place and was ready to do the job. It included Network Rail at board level had to approve that. It required government approval. Department for Transport, Secretary of State had to sign it off. So it was a very complex process to get to the point at which we were able to say to Network Rail, we are now triggering this transfer. And after a period of about 6 weeks between trigger and the actual transfer being effected, everybody was committed. But it was a long process and a very complex one. And of course, in terms of ensuring that there was readiness to make that transfer happen, as I've already touched on, the incoming infrastructure manager had to get ORR safety authorization. They needed to put the safety management system in place. They needed to get ORR sign-off on a network license. They had to get a network code in place. License amendments had to be changed. It's just worth reflecting that Network Rail's license itself had to be changed, and that the ORR had to approve under Network Rail's license the fact that Network Rail was going to divest some of its assets to another party. So there was lots of regulatory process in this, track access agreements with all of the operating companies, including the freight. And yes, there is still a bit of coal traffic that runs down the valley lines, and actually negotiating track access with the freight companies as part of the divestment and the takeover of the valley lines under the new arrangement was an enormously complex and very difficult process. And I won't go into the detail of that now, we don't have time, but it was very, very difficult to achieve, but we got there. And there are all the connection agreements with the surviving collieries at the top end of the valleys, connection agreements with Network Rail, interface agreements, bridge agreements, telecoms access agreements, how the operational interface would work between Network Rail and the new infrastructure manager in Amy Keolis, how that would operate. All kinds of contracts that needed to be put in place for the IM services to be delivered successfully. And just as a nod towards something at the bottom of that table there, the key contracts, there are many, many contracts that Amy Keolis have in place to deliver the IM services. A number of them, quite a significant number, are termed key contracts. And these are ones that have the facility, in the case of an infrastructure manager failure, to be transferred to a replacement infrastructure manager body so that contracts don't fall. And a number of those key contracts are around the services that Network Rail itself is providing for the delivery of infrastructure management on the valley lines. Then, of course, inevitably, there were all the questions about getting the people in place, designing the new organisation, staffing it. There was a commitment by the First Minister of Wales a long way back to satisfy people at that stage working for Network Rail that they would not be obliged to transfer into the private sector, that if they wish to remain in the public sector, they could do so. And that's the REM, the retained employment model. And so in fact, what we have in place now is a number of staff within the new IM organisation who transferred through the TUPE arrangements, but also many who transferred under REM and whose employment was actually transferred from Network Rail to TFW, and TFW in effect supplies them back to the infrastructure manager organisation, but they are TFW employees, although under the day-to-day management of Amy Keolis. Then, of course, there were the resources, the materials, the inventories of what the spares that were available, what would transfer along with the people and the infrastructure assets, putting transport in place, developing a new depot. The picture there shows you the new infrastructure or the Infraco depot at Treforest Estate. And then there was all the work around data migration from the existing Network Rail systems into Amy Keolis's chosen asset management system, Maximo, about transferring data, about putting arrangements in place for systems that would not transfer and that they would continue to need to draw upon. So I hope you're getting the message that it was a multifaceted process. And I should just say, going back to that slide, the program that you see there, just a snapshot of the program, was a multi-page, many lined program of activities which we reviewed with Amy Keolis on a weekly basis. The top chart shows you a red, amber, green, a RAG status chart, which showed where and how progress was being made, what the issues were, and how they were being addressed. So there was a whole governance process that was very much on top of what was going on. At the same time, we needed to go through safety verification. This is a requirement of the ROGS regulations, and we use the common safety method for risk assessment and evaluation. And again, this is just an extract from what was a very extensive spreadsheet where risks or hazards through a number of hazard identification workshops were the hazards associated with transferring ownership and management of the infrastructure were identified. The potential outcomes of those hazards were assessed and scored. The safety measures to address them were put in place. The evaluation techniques, the documentary evidence that would be needed to address those hazards and it was a process that followed through across the spreadsheet. What was called the change validation panel for safety verification was but it by a number of independents. It included TF data. It included Network Rail. ORR had an open invitation to come and observe, and they did that on a number of occasions. And at the end of it, there is an independent assessor who, in effect, gives his verdict on the process and the completeness that the hazard identifications have all been worked through, and the risks have been appropriately managed prior to transfer. And again, that was a key part of what needed to be put in place before transfer. So I'm going to just whiz through a little bit about what was that's enough on the process, probably too much on the process of how to make it work, but it absorbed the best part of 3 years of my working life, and I think I've just given a bit of a snapshot of that in just a few minutes. But if you get the sense of the complexity and the difficulty of doing some of these things, that's really what I'm trying to get across. I'm not going to talk particularly about the figures that you see in front of you. You obviously understand it's a relatively small network, but for us in TFW, it's a big network, and it is our only network, and that is what we are now focusing on. And through this discovery process that the incoming infrastructure manager was involved with, called discovery, in the first phase of the contract, it did involve to some extent getting out on the ground, getting boots on the ground, going and poking things, prodding things, looking at the assets, as well as doing desk studies, looking at reports and data from systems and so on. And I'm just going to show across some of the asset categories what some of those issues were. Perhaps the more positive part of the discovery report that the ACIL finalised was track. Generally, the view of track condition on the valley lines was reasonably positive. There were obviously track quality issues at some S&C locations, but the primary issue of the track asset on the valley lines is rail age, and there is an extensive volume of pre-1977 rail on the network with a combination of headwear and sidewear. And so that is driving what is expected to be a very substantial renewals program in the coming 5 years or so, 5 to 10 years, to address that particular issue, particularly as you will no doubt grasp the fact that the introduction of more frequent services, new rolling stock with different wheel rail interface characteristics, it's important obviously that we address the rail issues on the network. It may come as no surprise to say that there were bigger problems found off track, a substantial backlog in vegetation management issues. The valleys have a particular problem with invasive species, Japanese knotweed, Himalayan balsam, and so on. And yes, in the picture on the left, there are some location cases hidden away. That in itself gave rise to a number of issues, because there were quite a lot of assets that clearly have not been inspected over time. They're inaccessible. It's not just the vegetation problem itself, it's the fact that vegetation can cause other assets not to be properly inspected over time. And I should say, as I'm running through these, it's very important to emphasize, you know, I am not saying, look at what a poor job our predecessor did. In no way am I making judgment or pointing fingers. I think what this reveals is the difficulty of actually managing the railway network with limited budget. And so I'm not in any sense being judgmental. I'm really putting this forward as a snapshot of what we found and some of the issues that under TFW, under Welsh Government ownership and Amy Keolis' delivery of infrastructure management, some of the issues that we need to address and to begin to tackle. So please don't think that in any sense I'm pointing fingers. I'm certainly not doing that. Drainage, again, will come as no big surprise to you that the big backlog of drainage maintenance work, relatively incomplete data on the existence of those assets and their condition and capacity, and therefore there is a significant program of work that will be necessary to improve drainage conditions. Access points, there were 15 on the network. Some of them were usable and okay. Others, as you see on the right-hand side, the two right-hand pictures, certainly were in very poor condition or not usable at all. Structures was the area where perhaps there's the greatest concern about asset condition. Walls, culverts, bridges, and so on. And you can see some stats there. There are almost 700 walls, close on 300 bridges. Walls themselves, as with many of the other assets, there's a backlog of intervention, backlog of basic maintenance, vegetation clearance, and the like. Structures, again, a huge backlog of inspection reports that have identified defects that need attention, that frankly have just not happened. So there's quite a large population of those, and this is a problem which is going to have to be addressed over time. So that's a little bit of a rogues gallery, but as I say, I'm not pointing fingers. I'm certainly not saying, look what a poor job was done before and what a great job we're going to make of it. That's not my intention at all. I've talked a lot about setting up Amy Keolis as the infrastructure manager. The important thing just to touch on as we get towards the end of this is to talk about how TFW operates as the agency, as the representative of Welsh Government, as the owner of the infrastructure. There are three possible asset management models here on the screen. The bottom left, which is not what we want to do, is in effect where we just own the assets and leave the infrastructure manager to get on with it. That is not the case. You might argue perhaps that was the experience of the old RT1A contracts in the past, but that's not what we wanted to do. Neither is it appropriate on the right-hand side there at the bottom to say, well, in effect, we own the assets and we'll decide everything that needs to be done to them, and then we'll just tell Amy Keolis what to do week by week. That's not the model we want to operate either. It's balancing the ownership and management functionality, and as you see it from a strategic ownership point of view, obviously we have much more involvement in terms of setting the policies, but then it's for the infrastructure manager to turn those policies into plans and the delivery of those plans and the execution of work. And then there's a monitoring process in place. So there's an asset management plan that's been developed for each of the core asset categories. It means that not only through the procurement process of a new infrastructure manager in Amy Keolis as part of the ODP, it means that TfW also needed to set up its own engineering, infrastructure asset management client team. And indeed, my initial engagement was to help TfW scope that, to design an organization, and then to start staffing it. And that's developed over time. And through the early phase before transfer, I've already mentioned the long-term assessment of funding requirements for the Valley Lines. We had a key role to play in the review of mobilisation readiness, the safety verification, the go, no-go decision making, involvement with development of the initial asset management plans, working closely in acquiring data, building the understanding of the assets. And also, just to touch on something which one might not have thought about, it doesn't really apply in the case of Network Rail, but we were very conscious that under a contract there's a risk, a clear risk, that the infrastructure manager organisation will fail for some reason. It could fail financially, it could fail through withdrawal of license in the case of poor performance or whatever. And we had to have the contingency arrangements in place so that infrastructure management could be transferred from the failed party to a new infrastructure manager organization, because clearly without an active IM, then there could be no rail service in the valleys. So that was another stream of work that we were very heavily involved with, developing the infrastructure manager of last resort arrangements. And then post-transfer, and I'm getting very close to the end now, post-transfer, we've been involved in the whole governance, putting in place and making work the whole governance arrangements with the IM, looking at KPIs, monitoring delivery against the contract. We've been reviewing how those price adjustments work as the infrastructure manager discovers more about the condition of the assets and some of the issues and the things they need to do, or they believe they need to do to address some of those issues. It's about getting the renewals process underway. It's about life cycle modeling. It's about developing stakeholder relationships and actually using the data. We're getting a lot of data, a lot of information about the state of the assets, and we're trying to build the ownership initiatives around exploiting that to its best extent. And so a couple of examples here. Some of the work that's going on in the asset management team is developing mapping. We're looking at on the routes of the railway at flood risk sites. We're looking at the history with the coal authority, mining locations. Clearly that has significant implications for the integrity of the rail infrastructure. This is a geographical information system where we can overlay bits, different layers of information. So here we're looking at areas subject to flooding and unstable or suspect earthworks, trying to analyze the risk areas there. This is almost a live screen that we can look at, which looks at some of the faults going on, some of the operational issues on the railway, in this case trespass and vandalism. So these are abilities that we're building gradually within the team. So just to conclude, some early reflections of the core Valley Lines under new management. Here are some challenges. There's a lovely old joke of a guy who asks a country yokel. I think probably the joke itself originated in Ireland, but we won't be not casting aspersions about any nationalities. It's just a person who asks a country individual for directions to perhaps get to the big city, and after a long discussion the answer comes back, well, you do this, you do that, and you do that, but if I were you, I wouldn't start from here. Well, this is where we've started from, what I've been showing you, and even in the few months of ownership of the Valley Lines, there have been a number of problems, number of landslips. Top left, you see we had a known risk where skip lorries going along under a footbridge. There'd been a number of bridge strikes on that, and quite early on we actually had that bridge brought down by another skip lorry actually striking it. We've had problems with the intersection bridge, which carries the valley lines over the South Wales main line, just to the east of Cardiff Central. We've had flooding problems. Indeed, we had major flooding just a matter of days and weeks before the transfer itself. So we've taken on, perhaps I can call it a petulant child, but it's certainly a network with problems which need to be addressed and managed. So what have we learned? How do I summarize this? I think early on, perhaps a lot of the focus was about the contract, getting the infrastructure manager in place. One lesson that I drew very quickly was that we needed to focus as well on building the client abilities to operate an effective ownership regime. Early engagement really with everybody, absolutely essential. Good communication, particularly where you're embarking upon a major data transfer program from the incumbent Network Rail to the new organization. You need to be absolutely focused, very clear on what you want, and to track that whole process, because there are so many systems and so many bits of information, so many bits of data that are necessary. Getting to grips with network condition issues as soon as possible, making sure that the whole decision-making process is well governed and clear responsibilities. We used some independent assessment through the way that's very valuable too. Never underestimate the issues. I think it's probably fair to say that none of us had anticipated the difficulty of resolving the track access agreements with the freight operators, which took months and months of painstaking and very patient work by all parties. So, you know, be aware that lots of things can come out and bite you. Individual and corporate behaviour is very, very important, and again, not pointing fingers, but sometimes one did see mixed messages. One saw commitment from organisations. One saw a lot of commitment and agreement to work through the transfer framework agreement with TfW on transferring the assets from Network Rail to Welsh Government, but sometimes that was difficult to make happen. So individual and corporate behaviour is absolutely critical. Just some of the lessons, but the conclusion is yes, it can be done. And we said at the beginning, this is actually quite pioneering. I'm not aware that this has been done anywhere else in the country, of actually taking a piece of infrastructure out of the national network, putting it into a new ownership and management regime. It worked, it happened, it took effect on the 28th of March, and there are a lot of lessons to learn from it. So a bit tongue-in-cheek, but I said next time perhaps it might be easier. But I finish with a very famous quote from Winston Churchill, and I see, you know, the ongoing management of the valley lines as something stretching out in front of the Welsh Government, TfW, and our infrastructure manager. So it's no more than the end of the beginning. Yes, it's a major milestone that we achieved in March, but there's a lot to do. So it's no more than the end of the beginning. So with that, I'll say diolch and ask for questions. And I apologise that for some reason we had connectivity problems. I hope you've managed to stay with it through to the end, and I'm happy to field questions.
Okay,
thank you very much
indeed, Colin. So Steve Clark wants to ask a couple of questions. If you unmute yourself, Steve, please ask your questions.
Yes, hello everybody. Evening, Colin, as well. Really interesting presentation. Really interesting talk. I've got a couple of questions that I thought would just be easier to speak them rather than try and type them into the chat function. I just want to get your thoughts as to why you think that the original operator seemed to, from the photos that you've shown and everything, why they struggled so much, and why these core valley lines were allowed to kind of get into the state that they obviously are in, and why you think that TfL, the Welsh Government, and ACIL, why they believe they can do a better job than the previous operator to kind of improve things and bring things back. And also the second question was, If this is successful, do you believe that there are other areas of the network as a whole that could basically follow this, this structure? Do you think it's something that could be repeated in other parts of the mainline network, and almost like a slow renationalization, if you like, of certain parts of the network?
Okay, good questions. Thank you, Steve. I'll try and answer them as fully as I can. Why do I think that Network Rail managed the condition of the valley lines in the way that I've shown? Well, I was at pains to point out that, you know, I'm not in any sense trying to be judgmental or to say this is a representation of a very poor job. I wouldn't say that. I understand the budgetary issues that a major operator like Network Rail has to face. And I suppose the reality is that there's never enough money to do everything that you would want to do. And so perhaps the explanation behind the valley lines is that what budget there was for rail routes in Wales had to be spread amongst a much broader part of the network with other priorities, and obviously the main lines through to Swansea. So I suppose perhaps a way of looking at that is that the valley lines were a relatively small fish in a large fish pond, and had to fight and struggle for its share of budget. I can't comment on whether or not Welsh railway infrastructure is funded to the same level as in other parts of the network and on other routes of Network Rail ownership. It wouldn't be appropriate for me to do that, but it was part of a much bigger bun fight for the funds, if I can put it that way. And so perhaps, yes, it did get a relatively small share of crumbs. Now, you know, I am not saying that Network Rail mismanaged the valley lines. We have had a process, in fact, there is still a process in place of discussion with Network Rail where we have, through the transfer framework agreement, got an arrangement in place where if we felt that the condition of the assets was substandard, in the sense that they weren't compliant with standards or that they were somehow unsatisfactory or they were restraining capacity, they weren't as advertised, that we could claw money back from Network Rail from the sale of the assets. A bit like, you know, if you buy a house and find lots of problems with it, you expect the vendor to sort them or to drop the price. And there is a mechanism in place to do that. And we actually have supplied Network Rail with quite a long list of issues where we think the assets were in unsatisfactory condition, but that is a bone of contention. It's a live issue. I won't comment on that as to whether or not any money is likely to change hands. But there are different views on what constitutes a compliant network and a network that is under good stewardship. I'll say no more than that. Can we do a better job? I think the answer, time will tell. For us, of course, it's a big fish in a small pond, to use that simile again. And so I hope that we can work with Welsh Government to get the budgets in place to embark on major renewals programme. And of course, we've got the transformation programme as well, which is going to help and contribute to the overall improvement in the state of the network. And the second question you asked, if we demonstrate success with this, as we've already demonstrated, yes, it can be done. Is it likely to be rolled out elsewhere? Again, let's watch this space. I don't think there's any secret, perhaps, that that in a devolved country such as Wales, that control of its own destiny might be a very appealing one. So I wouldn't rule out possibility of that, but I think it's good to start small, to show how it works, and then possibly to learn those lessons, and maybe to apply them elsewhere, particularly as the railway industry across the whole country faces major structural change in the way it gets delivered. So I think, you know, I can't predict, I can't speculate, but watch this space. I think we may see this happening elsewhere, and I think that's why the ability to demonstrate that yes, it can be done, and it can be done legally, it can be done safely, it can be done effectively. I think that's a very important step on that journey.
Thank you,
That's lovely.
Colin.
Thanks very much, Colin. Thanks for answering those questions. Very informative. Very good. Thank you.
Okay, so Phil Kirkland has made a comment. Actually, in 1980, the former British Rail assets in the northeast of England were transferred in a similar manner to Tyne and Wear PTE, circa 60 suburban route miles to form the Tyne and Wear Metro. And he adds the challenges and scenarios were incredibly similar.
Yeah.
So we have another question from Bob Hazel. So it's a great presentation. Can Colin comment on just how much the transfer has cost? May well be enough. I don't know, but
I don't think that's a great secret. I think it's in the public domain. I think in effect the amount of money that was handed over to Network Rail was in the order of 500 million. I don't know precise figures. I don't know the precise mechanisms. It was a very, very complex process where, in fact, money was transferred from HM Treasury to Welsh Government, paid to Network Rail, and I think that there might have been something of a wooden dollars exchange on it. I can't honestly answer the precise mechanisms, but I think that was the kind of money that was involved, and the valuation of the valley lines was based on Network Rail's regulated asset base. There was a model for calculating the value of the assets. One might have taken a different view on whether they really were worth what the paper said they were worth, but nevertheless, that was the process that was embarked upon.
Thanks, Colin. Right, Alan Wilkins asked, where is the exact boundary between TfL and Network Rail on the line between Cardiff Central and Cardiff Queen Street?
Okay, I can't give you a precise mileage and chainage figure, but it is partway up the ramp. As you rise to get to Intersection Bridge, the boundary is on that ramp. So Intersection Bridge was part of the transfer, which probably I suspect a lot of people in Network Rail breathed a huge sigh of relief about, because that bridge is in relatively poor state. It is likely to need renewal in the relatively near future, and how you do that is a challenge for us all. I think it's not in a good location to do a major bridge renewal, particularly with the electrified main line underneath. But yeah, it's partway up the ramp.
Right. Okay, so Peter Halliwell asks, thanks Colin, a very frank talk. Since the transfer was completed, how have Amy Keolis Infrastructure Limit got on with their suppliers for services where Network Rail is also a customer, such as labour, subcontractors, plant suppliers, etc.? Have there been any instance where a choice has had to be made between works on Network Rail and Core Valley lines?
I'm not aware of any choices having to be made in that way. There are two things I would say in response to that. One is obviously, and I haven't touched on this, and I said at the beginning I wasn't going to, and it's not appropriate to, but clearly COVID has had a huge impact on delivery of infrastructure maintenance, just in the whole way of working. So that is a particular problem. In terms of delivery of services, no, I'm not aware of any particular problems where maybe a supplier is having to serve two lords and masters. I mean, supply of materials and so on. There are some quite testing issues around relatively small bits of equipment. I think, for example, signalling equipment. We've got one or two quite elderly token machines on the valley lines, which there are very few around, and Network Rail has a demand for them as well. So in some cases, the two infrastructure managers might be scrapping over the few assets that are available on the market from suppliers, but I'm not aware of any particular problems. I think Amy Keolis have got around those problems. But the other thing I would say is that, and I didn't go into this, but at the outset, the whole concept behind the infrastructure manager transfer was not to try and bite off too much too early. So Network Rail is continuing to supply quite a lot of services under a service agreement with Amy Keolis. So for example, a lot of on-track machines, fault management, actually the operational control of the railway still resides with Network Rail at the moment, with Network Rail signallers and controllers in the operating centre at Cardiff until such time as the new control centre is up and running. So there is a lot of supply to AKIL from Network Rail, and I would again just reflect, and perhaps this is a lesson learned, those of us perhaps have been involved as suppliers to Network Rail on many things. It was a voyage of discovery, I would say, putting it diplomatically, for Network Rail to suddenly find itself as a supplier to somebody else rather than drawing supplies from others, and that's been quite an interesting area to explore. But in straight answer to the question, I can't speak of any issues that I'm aware of, although my role at the moment is I'm not too hands-on in the day-to-day management of IM delivery by AKIL.
I could add, from a Network Rail point of view, I don't know of any conflict at the moment either. So I think it is working as intended at the moment. So a couple of other.
So, yeah.
Now, Andrew Goodyear points out that in Manchester, sections of the Network Rail were actually transferred over. So it's possibly before Network Rail, but sections of the rail system were transferred over to build the tram network. Phil
Yes.
Kirkland asks a question. Can you outline what has been the agreement in respect of deferred asset renewals? On Tyne and Wear Metro, a cash sum transfer in lieu of incomplete works was agreed. Sadly, this funding was not spent on the areas it was meant for in a timely manner. And as budgets were squeezed in subsequent years, asset condition deteriorated somewhat and resulted in the need now for a 10-year DFT asset renewal plan at nearly £400 million.
Right. Well, what I would say to that is that renewals has been a particularly testing area. It was very difficult to get to grips with what was in Network Rail's own renewals program for the Valley lines prior to transfer, and the delivery against those was a matter for discussion. I have to say that at the point of transfer, the renewals program looked relatively thin, but that may just be a question of the funding available and the budgets. I'm not going to suggest dark arts going on, but it is clear, and one of the lessons learned is that there has been a considerable hiatus in renewals management and renewals delivery around asset transfer. And I think, going back to a previous question, if it were to be put into place elsewhere on the network, that is certainly an issue that would need to be addressed. I think there has been difficulty in getting AKIL up to speed on getting renewals scoped and designed and delivered. There's a lot of rail that's been bought and gone out onto the ground, but actually delivering major renewals, it has been a problem. It's a problem that still needs to be addressed. But in terms of the long-term management of the asset, we have in the contract a mechanism where the IM proposes the renewals that it thinks are necessary. They come to Transport for Wales to adjudicate because TfW holds the renewals budget. And so in effect, we tell ACIL how much money we are prepared to spend on asset renewal. And where there's a gap between the IM proposal and what in effect Welsh Government can afford to do, there's a mechanism for that to be challenged. I didn't talk about this in the presentation, but we have in a jointly appointed independent reporter who can review and adjudicate on disputes on should this be a renewal or not. And where it is ruled that we haven't been able to fund an appropriate renewal, there's a mechanism then under the contract for additional maintenance monies to be paid to ACIL to continue looking after and to life extend those assets. I have to say, this is very early days, clearly, and you will understand that, but we need to make that model work. That's the concept, but we need to get to a position where we have a very clear renewals program. But yes, there has been a hiatus, and we need to get on top of it and to get renewals working. I hope that answers Phil's question.
Yep. So Phil Holborn has actually come on, and he said the exact boundary between Network Rail and Transport for Transport for Wales is 0 miles 13 chains on the CEJ, which is approximately midway between the intersection bridge and Bute Street Bridge.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Phil Kirkton's got another question. So further to Peter Halliwell's question, the biggest issue for us is attracting competent contractors for such as track renewals. With the award of term contracts with Network Rail, the main players are reluctant to commit or stretch themselves outside of the day job. So I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on that, Colin.
I think it's a general problem, isn't it? The availability of competent resourcing. In terms of renewals contractors, I think the concept is that, as I said, ACIL will self-deliver some of the renewals, but a relatively modest volume. TfW itself has contracted with a number of independent contractors, some of whom will be involved in delivery of the transformation works as well. And TfW may choose to place some renewals contracts with those parties to be managed by ACIL. I can't really comment on the capabilities. I mean, they're well-reputed organisations, quite substantial organisations. Of course, there is also a policy of sell to Wales, so to employ as much Welsh skill and experience as possible in delivering. But I can't really comment on individual capabilities. But yes, as an industry generally, with a huge amount of demand and HS2 going on as well, the available skilled resource could be thin on the ground, and that's a problem we'll have to keep on top of and be aware of.
Yeah, I could say to add to that, Network Rail's also trying to encourage some of the, if you like, medium-sized civils contractors to get involved in, not necessarily track work, but to get involved with Network Rail. And the Welsh Government certainly strongly supports, obviously, employing local contracting companies. And there are a number who are already engaged on quite a lot of work, both for Network Rail and on the upgrading of the Cardiff Metro network as a whole. So.
Yeah, indeed, there are. Yeah, Alan Griffiths, for example, is a sizable contractor that's involved in.
Yeah, various classic civils type work, isn't it? Yeah. So,
indeed.
Right.
Indeed.
Alan Wilkins has also pointed out that we've actually transferred some other bits of assets over the years for Nottingham Tram, Birmingham, and indeed for Croydon as well. So.
Yes.
So we have so I don't think we've ever tried anything quite as large a scale with the operations it's sort of entirely in one go. I think most of the others have involved closing sections of route and then reopening, and there's something else
Yes.
later.
Yes.
So as time is getting on, if there's no more questions, that's the end of the questions that have been asked. I'd like to call upon Andrew Wilson to propose a vote of thanks.
Good evening, Colin and Andy, and those of us that are left after a very spellbinding presentation from Colin. Colin, thanks very much for putting your views forward. Not an easy subject, a very complex subject on a very complex problem, which, yes, as Phil and others have pointed out, has been attempted before, was attempted on rail track, and it's been achieved, all with various difficulties, and not least the difficulties that we've had with communications under COVID, and even communications under evening conferences using the internet. I've been thoroughly interested in what's happened. It's been a marvelous opportunity for us all to ask questions and get some very honest answers. Can I just ask everybody if they will open their mics and give Colin a round of applause in the usual way, please? Would everybody just like to put their hands together? Thank you very much indeed, Colin.
That's a great pleasure. Thank you very much. I had a false start and had to go back to the box, but it worked in the end.
Okay, right then, guys. So thank you very much, Colin, once again.